call came on a Tuesday morning, and my attorney's voice was careful in the way it gets when he's about to tell you something he doesn't want to say. "Vera," he said, "are you absolutely certain about this?" I told him I was. He went quiet for a moment. I could hear him breathing on the other end. Then he said, "All right, come in Thursday. We'll get the paperwork started." I hung up and stood there in my kitchen for a long time, looking out at the backyard. The dogwood my late husband planted the year our son was born was just starting to bloom. Little pink flowers, same as every spring. I'd been looking at that tree for 31 years. I thought about the night before, about the restaurant, about the way she laughed. And I thought, yes, I am absolutely certain. Let me go back a bit, because none of this will make sense otherwise. My name is Vera. I'm 63 years old. I live in a 3-bedroom house in Raleigh, North Carolina, in the same neighborhood I moved into when I was 32 years old and newly widowed, with a 7-year-old boy, and not much else. My husband, James, died of a heart attack at 34. No warning. He was mowing the lawn on a Saturday and then he wasn't anymore. People asked me after the funeral what I was going to do. I told them I was going to figure it out. They nodded like that meant nothing. What figuring it out looked like in practice was this. I worked as a licensed practical nurse at Wake County Medical Center for 22 years. I picked up extra shifts when I could. I clipped coupons. I drove a car with 200,000 miles on it until the transmission gave out, and then I drove it a little more. I packed my son's lunch every single day from kindergarten through 12th grade. Peanut butter and honey on whole wheat, an apple, sometimes crackers if we were doing okay that week. His name is Andrew. He was the most important thing in my life. Still is, I suppose. Even now, even after everything, what Andrew never knew, what I never told him, and what I've thought hard about whether that was a mistake, is that around the time he started middle school, I started buying property. It started almost by accident. The house 2 doors down from us went into foreclosure in 2003. The bank priced it low just to move it. I'd been saving quietly for years, tucking money into an account James didn't even know about when he was alive, not for any suspicious reason, but because I grew up in a house where we never talked about money, and I always believed a woman should have something of her own, just in case. I used that money as the down payment. I fixed the house up myself on weekends, mostly new fixtures, fresh paint, refinished floors. I have a YouTube video from that era somewhere of me learning to tile a backsplash. I was terrible at it. I kept going. I rented that house to a young couple, school teachers, for 14 months. In 14 months, the rent covered the mortgage entirely. Then I had equity. Then I had options. I bought another property the following year. Then another. I never told Andrew because I didn't want him growing up thinking there was a safety net. I wanted him to work like there wasn't one, the way I had. I wanted him to know what it felt like to earn something with your hands and your back and your time. I thought that was the right way to raise a person. I still believe that, mostly. By the time Andrew graduated from NC State with his engineering degree, I owned 8 properties. By the time he got the job in Charlotte and started dating his fiancée, I owned 19. Nobody knew. My attorney knew. My accountant knew. My neighbor, Ruth, who'd watched Andrew grow up and sometimes helped me repaint between tenants, she knew. Everyone else just knew me as Vera, the retired nurse from down the street. That was fine with me. Andrew called me on a Sunday in January to tell me he was engaged. I cried a little, the good kind, and told him I was so happy. I meant it. Her name is Sloane. She's 31, works in marketing for a pharmaceutical company, and she grew up in a suburb outside of Charleston. She's pretty in a careful, deliberate way. She always looks like she's dressed for a photo. The first time I met her, she shook my hand very firmly, smiled very brightly, and spent a large portion of dinner talking about a trip she'd taken to Tuscany. I tried. I want to be clear about that. I brought her a bread pudding the first time I visited their apartment, a recipe from Andrew's grandmother, and she said it looked wonderful and left it on the counter. I asked her about her family. I listened when she talked. I remembered small things she mentioned. That she played lacrosse in college, that she had a dog named Pepper as a child, that she was allergic to tree nuts. And I tried to work those details into conversation to show her I'd been paying attention. She was never unkind to me. She was just distant, the way people are distant when they've decided you're not someone who particularly matters. Her mother is a woman named Frances. Frances was married to a man who'd made a great deal of money in commercial real estate before they divorced, and she had spent the years since maintaining a lifestyle that made clear she intended to keep that money visible. She lived in a large house in Blowing Rock. She summered in Maine. She had opinions about wine. The first time I met Frances was at Andrew's apartment, a casual dinner he'd arranged. She arrived 20 minutes late, kissed Sloane on both cheeks, and then turned to me and said very warmly, "And you must be Andrew's mother. He's told me so much about you. Nursing. What a rewarding career." The word rewarding had a particular quality to it, like she was complimenting a child's drawing. I smiled and said, "It was. I loved it." She patted my hand once and turned back to her daughter. That was the whole of our relationship until the engagement dinner. The dinner was held at a restaurant in Charlotte called Alderton's. It's the kind of place that doesn't put prices on the menu and has a sommelier who appears at your elbow just as you're starting to feel comfortable. Frances had made the reservation. Frances had chosen the restaurant. Frances, I would later learn, had also chosen who sat where. I arrived a little early, the way I always do. The hostess walked me to a table set for 12. There were little white cards at each place. I found my card and stood looking at it for a moment. I was seated at the far end of the table, not across from my son, not near him. Down at the end, between Sloane's aunt, whom I'd never met, and an empty chair that turned out to belong to a college friend of Sloane's who talked primarily about a podcast she was producing. Frances was seated at the center of the table, next to Andrew. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I sat down and introduced myself to the aunt and decided to have a pleasant evening anyway. The dinner went well enough for the first hour. The food was excellent. There was a salmon something that I would have liked the recipe for. I talked with the aunt, whose name was Rosemary, and discovered she was a retired school librarian from Greensboro, and we got on quite well. I was starting to think the evening might be fine. Then came the gifts. Andrew and Sloane hadn't asked for gifts, but a few people had brought them anyway. A bottle of champagne, an envelope, a small wrapped box. I had brought something too. I had spent 3 months on it. It was a recipe book, not a store-bought one. I had gone through every recipe I owned, from the index cards my mother wrote out by hand in the 1970s, from the church cookbook our congregation put together in 1988, From the legal pad my mother-in-law gave me when James and I first got married, with notes in the margins that said things like, "James likes extra pepper," and "Don't tell him there's zucchini in this." I had rewritten all of it by hand into a hardcover blank journal I found at an art supply store, organized by occasion: Sunday dinners, holidays, company coming, sick days, special occasions. I had included notes throughout. The story behind Andrew's birthday cake, which I'd made from scratch every year since he turned 1. The potato soup that James used to request, specifically when it was cold outside. The lemon bars that my mother brought to every funeral we ever attended in our family, which sounds sad, but which I mean warmly, because they were the most comforting thing I know. I had drawn a small illustration at the start of each section. I am not an artist. They were simple. A turkey for the holiday section, a steaming bowl for the sick day section. I did my best. I gave it to Andrew when Sloane was opening the champagne. He looked through the first few pages and I saw something cross his face, something real, something that looked like the boy who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard. "Mom," he said quietly. "It's for both of you," I said. "For when you have a home together." He hugged me, and then Frances spoke. She had leaned over from her seat and was looking at the book in Andrew's hands. She tilted her head the way someone does when they're deciding whether to bother engaging with something. "Oh," she said, "a recipe book." She laughed a small, silvery laugh. "How absolutely darling. Homemade." Sloane glanced at it and said, "That's sweet." "Like something from a church bake sale," Frances continued. And she wasn't saying it to me exactly. She was saying it to the table, to the room, performing it. "I love that." She looked at me then directly for just a moment. "You must have put so much time into that. Bless your heart." In the South, "bless your heart" is not a compliment. I watched Andrew. I watched him hear it. I watched him look down at the book for a moment, and then I watched him not say anything. He laughed a little, uncomfortable, quiet. He set the book down on the table. That laugh was the thing that did it, not Frances. I dealt with women like Frances my entire life. They have a very specific weapon, and they use it very specifically, and I have never had the energy to be wounded by it. But Andrew, who I had packed lunches for. Andrew, who had cried in my arms when his grandmother died. Andrew, who knew what that book meant, what every single page of it cost me in time and care. Andrew laughed. I excused myself to the restroom. I stood in the bathroom of Alderton's for about 4 minutes. I looked at myself in the mirror. Then I went back to the table, finished my water, said I had a headache and an early morning, kissed my son on the cheek, and left. I drove home in the dark, and I did not cry, which surprised me. I've been a nurse. I've held the hands of people in the last hours of their lives. I've sat with families in waiting rooms and delivered news that changed everything. I've learned over a long career to stay level when things get hard, to think before I react, to consider what actually matters. So I didn't call Andrew that night. I didn't send an angry text. I went home and I made myself a cup of tea, orange blossom, the kind I like. And I sat at my kitchen table and I thought about my mother, who never had anything in her own name. I thought about James, who died without a will and left me figuring it out. I thought about 22 years of night shifts, of driving home in the dark, of eating cereal for dinner so Andrew could have chicken. And I thought about 19 properties across 4 counties, about the portfolio my accountant had just reviewed, about the document my attorney had helped me draft 2 years ago. The estate plan that reflected, very precisely, what I intended to happen to what I'd built. The next morning, I called my attorney. His name is Douglas, and he's been my attorney for 11 years. He is a quiet, methodical man who does not rattle easily. When I told him what I wanted to do, he was quiet for a long moment. "Vera," he said, "are you absolutely certain about this?" "Yes," I said. "You understand that once this is executed, Douglas," I said gently. "I understand." He came around. He always does. What I asked him to do was this. I wanted to revise my estate plan. The original document had left a significant portion of my assets to Andrew. Not all of it, because I've always believed in giving while you're living and giving to causes that matter. And over the years, I'd made commitments to a nursing scholarship fund at a community college in Raleigh and to a food bank I'd volunteered at when Andrew was small. But Andrew's portion had been substantial. I reduced it, not eliminated. I want to be very clear about that, because I am not a cruel person, and he is still my son, and I still love him in that helpless, total way you love your children, even when they disappoint you. I reduced his inheritance to enough to be meaningful, enough to matter. Not enough to be a fortune. I redirected the rest. I increased the scholarship fund considerably. I set up a trust for a transitional housing nonprofit I've been following for years. They help women leaving difficult situations get back on their feet, and I like their model, and I had thought for some time about doing more for them. I added a specific bequest to my neighbor Ruth, who has been a better friend to me than most people ever have. And I did one more thing. In the original document, Andrew was listed as the trustee for several accounts, the person who would manage things on my behalf if I became unable to manage them myself. I removed him from that role and replaced him with my accountant, who is a careful and honest woman, and who has known about my finances for years. I'm not punishing my son. I want to be careful with that word, punishing. That's not what this is. What it is this. I spent 31 years building something, and I am going to decide, clearly and with a full heart, what becomes of it. That has always been my right. It is more my right now than it's ever been. I didn't tell Andrew any of this, not at first. He called me 2 days later. And I picked up, and we had a perfectly ordinary conversation. He asked how I was feeling. I said fine. He mentioned that Francis had enjoyed the dinner. I said that was nice. He said Sloane had put the recipe book on their bookshelf. I said, good. Then a week passed, and then another. And then something happened that I hadn't quite anticipated. Sloane called me. Directly. She never called me directly. She said she'd been looking through the book. She said she'd sat down with it one evening. She didn't say why, didn't explain what had prompted it, and she'd read it through. She got quiet on the phone, and then she said, "The part about the lemon bars, did you really make those for every funeral?" I said yes. I told her the story. My mother believed that when someone was grieving, they needed something sweet and something made by hand. It didn't fix anything. Nothing fixed anything. But it was something you could do, and something was better than nothing. Sloane was quiet for a moment. My mom, she started. She can be. She stopped. I'm sorry about what she said. About the book. I thanked her. I told her I appreciated it. She asked me if I'd teach her to make the potato soup. I said I would. Andrew found out about the estate changes in March when he came to visit, and we had the conversation I'd been preparing for. I sat across from him at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where I'd made decisions for 30 years, and I explained what I had done and why. He was quiet for a long time. "Mom," he finally said. "How much?" He stopped. Started again. "How long have you been?" "A long time," I said. He put his hands flat on the table. He looked at them. "I didn't say anything," he said. "At the dinner, I didn't." "No," I said. "You didn't." He didn't try to explain it away. That mattered to me. He didn't say I didn't want to make a scene or, "You know how she is." He just sat with it. After a while, he said, "I'm sorry, Mom." I looked at my son, this person I had made and raised and sent into the world, and I thought about the dandelions. I thought about the birthday cakes. I thought about the night he was 7 years old, and we sat on the back steps together, and I told him his father wasn't coming home, and the way he'd put his small hand in mine like he was the one trying to comfort me. "I know you are," I said. We sat there for a while. The dogwood was visible through the kitchen window, just starting to come into bloom. "I'm not taking it back," I said. "The changes. I thought about it a lot, and I believe they're right." He nodded slowly. "Okay. What I built is mine to decide about." "I know, Mom." He looked up at me. "I know. We had dinner together that evening. I made the potato soup, his grandmother's recipe, extra pepper, the way his father had liked it. We talked for a long time, not about Francis, not about money, about James, mostly, who Andrew barely remembered but wanted to know, about what his father had been like, about how we'd met in the break room of a hospital where I was a nursing student and James was an orderly, and how he'd offered me the last of his terrible vending machine coffee like it was a gift, and how I'd taken it even though it was terrible, because I liked the way he smiled. Andrew cried a little. So did I. That's the part no one tells you about being a mother. You can be angry and heartbroken and utterly certain you're right, and you can still love someone so completely that it doesn't contradict any of it. All of those things live in the same place inside you at the same time. Frances called me in April. I don't know how she got my number. She was warm and smooth on the phone in that particular way people are when they've recently learned something that surprised them. And she said she'd love to have lunch, just the two of us, and get to know each other better. I told her I appreciated the invitation. I told her I was quite busy lately, but I'd keep it in mind. She asked if Andrew had mentioned. She trailed off, chose a different direction. Whether I'd be involved in planning any of the wedding events. I said that was really a question for Andrew and Sloane. She laughed her small, silvery laugh, a little less certain this time. I said, "Frances, it was lovely talking to you. You take care now." I hung up and stood in the same spot in my kitchen where I'd stood the morning after the engagement dinner. The dogwood out the window. The pink flowers. I had spent 31 years building something. I had done it quietly and on my own terms, and without asking anyone's permission, and without performing it for anyone's approval. That's the thing about real wealth, and I don't only mean the financial kind, though I mean that too. The real kind is what you've built when nobody's watching. It's the night shifts and the double batches and the index cards in your mother's handwriting. It's knowing who you are so completely that when someone tries to make you feel small, they can't quite find the place to put the blade. I know who I am. I always have. I made myself a cup of tea, orange blossom, the kind I like, and sat down at my kitchen table, and I opened a new blank journal, and I started writing down recipes. This time for my grandchildren, whenever they're ready. I've got time. Whenever they're ready. People ask me sometimes if I regret any of it. The changes to the estate plan. The phone call to Douglas. Walking out of that restaurant in the middle of a dinner that was supposed to be a celebration. I don't. And I've sat with that long enough to trust it. Here's what I've come to understand, not as a moral lesson anyone taught me, but as something I lived my way into. The way you treat someone when you believe they have nothing to offer you. That is the most honest thing about you. Frances wasn't rude to me because she was having a bad night. She was rude to me because she looked at a retired nurse with a handwritten recipe book and made a calculation. She decided I didn't count. That calculation was automatic, practiced, and completely revealing. And Andrew, my Andrew, made his own calculation in that moment. He chose comfort over courage. He chose the table over his mother. I don't say that with hatred. I say it because it's true, and because pretending otherwise would be a dishonesty I'm not willing to live with at 63 years old. What I did in the days after wasn't revenge. Revenge is about making someone else feel pain. What I did was much quieter than that. I looked at what I had built, all of it, every property and every decision, and every night I ate cereal so my son could eat chicken, and I asked myself, does the way this is structured still reflect what I actually believe? And the answer was no. So I changed it. That's not punishment. That's integrity. The hard truth about building something on your own over a long time without anyone watching is that it requires you to know yourself very precisely. You can't sustain that kind of effort on other people's approval because other people's approval is unreliable. You have to be the one who knows what the work is worth. You have to carry that knowledge yourself, quietly, and not need anyone to confirm it. I carried it for 30 years. Nobody called me impressive when I was patching drywall on a weekend. Nobody congratulated me when the rent came in and I rolled it directly into the next down payment. Nobody saw any of it. And that was fine. That was actually the point. What Sloane did, calling me, reading the book, asking about the lemon bars, that mattered to me more than she probably knows. Not because it changed anything practically, but because it was honest. She didn't owe me that call. She made it anyway. That takes something. I don't know yet what kind of woman she's going to be. But that phone call was a data point I'm holding on to. Andrew still has a long way to go. So do most of us if we're telling the truth. The question isn't whether you failed the moment. Almost everyone fails the moment, at least once. The question is whether you can sit across from the person you hurt at a kitchen table with no audience and say, "I'm sorry," without a single qualifier attached to it. He did that. It doesn't fix what happened, but it's the beginning of something real, and I'd rather have something real than something smooth. I'm still here, still writing down recipes, still watching the dogwood bloom every spring. I've got time, and I've always known exactly what I'm worth.